Not the people around Wichita, though. They still remember him. Flash forward to modern times. A few years ago, 3 young athletes were struck down, all of them during athletic competition. They all lived in the Wichita area near Father Capon's hometown of Pilsen. One was a pole vaulter who was practicing before a college meet, and he went up and he missed the mat and he landed on his head. Yeah. And he went to the hospital. His brain swelled. They had to cut open his skull, and his parents were told, prepare for your son's death. If he survived, he would be a vegetable. I mean, I don't like that term, but that's what they actually told him. A second was a girl in middle school near Wichita. She lived in Wichita, actually. She was a soccer player, and she was participating in a soccer match. She scored a goal and then ran over to the sidelines and began spitting up blood. It was the start of an autoimmune disorder that, over the course of weeks, consumed her body. Again, her parents were told, prepare for your daughter's death. There's nothing we can do. A third was a marathon runner who ran a marathon charity race and dropped dead at the finish line. Well, they thought he was dead. There were no signs of life. And he was in the ambulance carrying him to the hospital. Again, nothing. When all of a sudden, he woke up. He sat up and he recognized one of the men in the ambulance, and he said, what's going on? He was fine. In all 3 cases, prayers have been offered to Father Capon by friends and family. In the case of the marathon runner, he had a cousin who literally at the finish line himself dropped to his knees and prayed to Father Capon. These are well-documented cases. They kept prayer diaries. So if you're a Vatican official investigating these things, this is like, you know, a trifecta. This is the pot of gold here. I actually interviewed the man whose job it is to investigate and look for miracles. And he loved going to Kansas. He said not only, you know, most cases of miracles, you have to make a connection between the prayers that were offered and a healing. And that's not as easy as it sounds. Because, you know, what if people prayed to more than one saint? Well, that's a problem. These people not only prayed to one man, but they documented it all in diaries. And this guy, as I say, he loved going to Kansas. He went back and forth, investigated all 3 miracles to pick the best one. He also told me he loved steaks, and he loved the way the Kansans did steaks. They cooked their steaks, so he would go to the biggest steak houses when he was there. I'm sure that helped around back too as well. Father Capon, by the way, is still awaiting some Vatican action. He has not been declared a saint. He has not been beatified. And a couple of years ago in Washington, when President Obama gave him, I think it was the Medal of Honor, posthumously, of course, the veterans, some of the veterans who served with him were at the ceremony, including that sergeant he had carried on his shoulders for 60 miles. And they asked one thing. They were so happy that that Medal of Honor was given to him, and they asked one thing: why hasn't the Vatican declared him a saint? It takes a long time. They're being very, very careful. Not all people who experience miracles, we call them in Italian miracolati, not all miracolati are themselves saints. Not all are willing. Not all want to be known as the person who was saved by a miracle. There was the case in 1986 of a German girl. She was 13 years old. She and her friend went swimming in some kind of public pool. It was a waterwork facility. They shouldn't have been there. And at some point there was suction, and it pulled them down underwater. They were underwater for 22 minutes. Their friends were timing it, and their friends were praying already to Maria Crescencia Hoss, who was a local nun, who was a well-known religious figure. Well, they pulled her friend's body out, and the ambulance came. She was dead. And they then pulled her body out, and for some reason she was not dead. But they presumed she was brain dead, and they took her to the hospital that told her parents, well, she'll never really recover. She made a full recovery. Okay? 15 years later, when the Vatican was investigating this miracle, and eventually used that miracle to declare Maria Crescentia Haas a saint, this girl, who was now in her 20s, refused to cooperate. She refused to give testimony. She did not show up at the canonization ceremony. It wasn't meaningful to her. So you don't have to have the cooperation of someone who presumably benefited from a miracle. There are those at the Vatican and elsewhere who say we place too much attention on medical miracles. That we should go back to this broader understanding of signs and wonders and miracles that is less dependent on doctors and on spectacular mechanisms. And we should be looking more at the results: conversion, reconciliation, acts of charity, acts of love. I think actually that does go back to the understanding of miraculous signs that Christians had in the early centuries of the church. Because in those days, a miracle did not have to be something that contravened the laws of science. For one thing, the laws of science weren't that well defined. But there was this wider understanding that a sign, a wonder, was a moment when God spoke to you in some really significant way. It was when you felt the presence of God and you felt He was directing you towards something. And it could have been a vision, it could have been something you saw or heard or simply experienced in your mind, in your spirit, in your heart. But it usually turned out to be a turning point in life. And so you didn't have to prove it. You didn't have to prove it. You experienced it and you showed the results of miracles and signs in your own life. And as I say, what my point is that, and I mentioned this in my book, I think that people at the Vatican are kind of opening up to this wider understanding that maybe we shouldn't be tied so closely to having science verify our miracles. One more point and then I'll open it to questions. People have asked me if in writing this book I went in as a skeptic and came out believing in miracles, or whether in the course of my research I witnessed something supernatural, something that made a shiver go down my spine. I spent my life avoiding questions like that, of course. I'm still a journalist, so I have to keep a distance from things. But to be honest, the purpose of my book was not to pass judgment on miracles, and not even to witness something like that. But there was a moment when a shiver ran down my spine. It was a moment when I understood the point that I was just making a minute ago, that not every miracle has to be spectacular or upset the laws of nature. And I'll read you one last section from the book. In the course of my research, I interviewed a Jesuit professor of spirituality in Rome. He's Croatian, and his father, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And he still teaches spirituality at the Gregorian University, although he has fewer students. He says seminarians, everybody used to study spirituality, now they're studying canon law and other things. Anyway, we were talking about miracles. He described a trip he made to Lourdes, this is Father Csikszentmihalyi, where he saw many elderly people seeking cures for their ailments, from backaches to migraines. Now, Csikszentmihalyi was a psychologist, and as a psychologist, he had always been deeply moved by the suffering of children with brain disabilities. And at Lourdes, he found himself wondering why God couldn't cure these children too. He said, "They say no one leaves Lourdes without an answer, so this was my question. Father St. Martoni was standing in front of the Lourdes grotto, where the older pilgrims lined up to immerse themselves in the waters, when he was distracted by the sound of a girl, about 8 years old, who stood off to the side. She was seriously disabled, foaming at the mouth and thrashing her arms in uncontrolled movements. As St. Martoni recalled, "I said to the Virgin Mary, 'Look at her. How can this be? Why can't you help her with a miracle?' At that moment, the girl's mother came up to her, and after hugging her with great tenderness, calmly carried her away. Watching the scene, St. Martoni began to cry. He said, 'I had my answer. There are miracles, and there are miracles. I couldn't stand to see this child even for 1 minute, but this woman would love her all her life.'" And that, I think, helps explain the point that I was making in my book, that there are probably more miracles than we can see or measure or validate through science that go on all around us. So thank you, and I'll take any questions, any and all questions you may have. Yes?
I don't know if you've heard it, but over the last 15 years, I've heard reports of, in the Middle East and North Africa, Muslim individuals that are seeing visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary, and I never know what to make of it. I mean, then I had a neighbor, a young woman, who was some kind of evangelical something or other. They had a mission in Syria until that couldn't be, and then they moved it across the border. And I asked her, and she said, you know, they come in here all the time and tell us about that. Does the Vatican ever think about that, or?
If you talk, did everybody hear that question? Yeah. If you talk to people at the Vatican about that, you would find maybe 2 or 3 individuals who would be kind of tracking that in the back of their minds, but not as part of their work. So I also have heard of occasions, I did hear of one case in Syria, maybe it was the same one, and other cases in Africa and the Middle East where that also involved Muslims who, you know, I mean, they, in their own way, venerate Mary as well. And so I have heard of this kind of apparitional experience crossing interreligious lines. But you won't find the Vatican kind of tracking that officially at all. For one thing, as I explained in my book, the Vatican can't even keep track of all the strictly Catholic apparitions going on all around the world. They count on local bishops to handle that. So in this case, it would be the local bishop's responsibility to investigate, to quietly go around and check into it and see what's really happening. If it's important enough, he might signal it to the Vatican. But the Vatican does not have a department of the supernatural. They have various offices whose responsibility might extend over apparitions. And when it comes to apparitions, especially if there are messages involved, it usually goes to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the doctrinal office, which is being very vigilant to make sure that the content of the message is in line with church teaching, because if it isn't, they want to warn Catholics, look, red flag here. But there are hundreds of apparitions that never get that far. They're handled at the strictly local level. Which is why, for reporters, for anybody, they're hard to get a handle on unless, as I say, they go viral. Unless there's a website that suddenly pops up that is dedicated to these things, and that's happening more and more. Yes?
So this is a question more about Vatican politics than it is miracles. But
I'm happy to answer that.
Well, there's a ton I want to add about the Vatican Bank and some other stuff,
yeah.
With respect to Pope Benedict, I'm curious on two things with him. One, if in retrospect now, is any additional light on why the resignation? And then secondly, what does he do now? What does an ex-pope, living ex-pope do? What's he up to?
He's just being Benedict. He's reading, he plays the piano. He's doing what he promised he would do, which is quietly fade into the background and not have any public role, which is quite remarkable. My first book, The Vatican Diaries, talks about Benedict a lot, and the revised edition, which is in the back, available along with this book afterward, and I'll gladly sign them. It spoke about the reasons for his resignation. I think we can take pretty much on face value his reasons for resigning. When I retired and we moved back to the States, I had been covering the Vatican for more than 30 years, and I retired. And it was early 2013, we were back in Minnesota. We were actually up in Bemidji. And I would send my friends, my journalist friends in Rome, emails because I was convinced the Pope was going to resign. And the reason I was concerned was that I had my book coming out in early February, and I thought, if he resigns before then, they're going to want me to rewrite this thing. It's going to screw it all up. So I had vested interest here. And I would write emails saying, do you think he's going to resign? Because to me, it seemed like he had cleared his calendar for 2013. He had completed all his big projects. And he looked to me like a very weary person, like he was burdened by the office. He had suffered through these scandals at the Vatican of the leaked documents. This weighed very heavily on him, psychologically. His own aides were, caught up in these power struggles. His own butler, the guy who was supposed to serve him suit and fold his clothes, was surreptitiously photocopying his personal documents and handing them off to an Italian journalist at night. Well, not surreptitiously exactly. He was actually using the office photocopier. It's odd that no one noticed that the butler was photocopying thousands of pages. But anyway, so yeah, I think the scandals weighed heavily on Benedict. I think he realistically felt this is at a point where, I don't have the energy to manage this anymore, and the church needs somebody to come in with a stronger hand. And in effect, that's what he said when he resigned. I, by the way, flew to Rome on February 10th, 2013. When I walked into the Vatican press office the next morning, having not been there for more than a year, and just in time to hear Pope Benedict announcing his resignation. So I was considered to be a prophet, although it actually shocked me when it happened too. And as it happened, my book came out 2 days later, so it was like a perfect storm for the publishing world. It couldn't have been better. In fact, my publisher thought I had flown to Rome, held a late-night conversation with Benedict, and asked him to resign.
So is he now, in terms of hierarchy, considered like former priest, or is he back to being a cardinal?
Oh, once a priest, always a priest. He's a priest. He's still a bishop, as far as they're concerned. He's, I guess, still a cardinal, although he doesn't vote in the conclave. And there's some question about whether he's still a cardinal, actually. He's the former bishop of Rome, and yeah, nobody's really clear about that. Yeah. One thing that surprised me was that when he resigned, he didn't kind of issue a document saying, and here's how it's going to work. I was like, there's no job description for a retired pope. There's nothing about what are the rules here. There are no rules. The next pope who resigns could go on the lecture circuit afterward, like, Hillary Clinton. And I'm sure they would pay big bucks. But I think it was a very courageous move. I think it was a great gift to the Catholic Church. And I think the way he is acting as a retired pope is exactly in his style. Just quiet, unassuming. He really did his service, and then he laid aside the office and made it clear that, the respect goes to the office and not only to the man who held it, so, yes.
So one of the things that I found fascinating about your book, and I'm curious to know whether it reflects your own, relationships with these people, but I ended up having, as a result of reading this, a huge amount of sympathy for these people at the Vatican, these various named people that you have in their offices, whose responsibilities they are to, in one shape or another, to arm wrestle with these, in cases whether they are or aren't legitimate, they're remarkable kind of events that they have to arm wrestle with. And I ended up with, looking at it through their eyes and going, they're holding on to an attempt to have a balanced perspective here, where in a world that is a world of science and of enlightenment, but there's also a world of wonder and mystery, and trying to weave a path that honors the opportunity for God to act as he sees fit in the world, but also a world in which con men exist, and people that are maybe not completely con men, but they are self-deluded to some extent or another. And so you end up feeling I ended up feeling just a real great deal of sympathy for the people that I think of as in the trenches of trying to, incorporate and represent what the church's response should be to these events.
Right. Well, I totally agree with you. These people are caught very often between opposing forces, people pulling for, no, why can't this be declared authentic? Medjugorje, for example. Look at all the good it's been doing. Why is the Vatican holding back? And other people saying, look, if something turns out not to be real and to be fraudulent in some way, look at the harm it could cause. And, you find both sentiments, even inside the Vatican, even in individuals who may, fear making one little mistake could affect the faith lives of millions of people. And so that's why they're very careful about it. It's interesting that you would say you feel more sympathy. Yeah, I do too. And I found that in writing actually both of my books, really, I didn't set out to do this, but I think I ended up doing it, is portraying far more sympathetic picture of the Vatican as it tries to deal with all kinds of issues. And not that, my first book was a little hard on the Vatican in many ways, but I think it treats the individuals as human beings